Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13th, 1798, or Tintern Abbey as I will refer to it from here on in, is another one of the most famous of Wordsworth's poems, and the fact that it is positioned at the very end of the collection of lyrical ballads suggests its importance to the project as a whole. And indeed, it's not just the last poem in the book, it's also the last poem that Wordsworth wrote for the project, both of which imply in some way that his work on these ballads had led him up to this point. And that may all very well be true, although it's worth noticing that it is a poem that's very different from the other lyrical ballads we've looked at so far and will continue to look at in this course. For one thing, it's in blank verse, as few of the other lyrical ballads are, and it treats of rural life in a much more philosophical and explicitly poetic way. So if the purpose of the lyrical ballads was to celebrate rural life and rural speech, as Wordsworth says in his preface, which we will look at soon, this is clearly a different kind of poem from that. But even though at the same time it certainly develops many of the themes that we have seen in the other poems, such as the importance of human sympathy, the need to be responsive to others, and to the natural world. But it does so in a way that's somewhat more exclusive. The reflections of this poem seem to be the privilege of an educated poet rather than one of the homely lessons that Wordsworth draws from, say, the story of Simon Lee. It is also in many ways a more traditional poem than the other, or seems like it is. At first glance, the title seems to signal that the poem will fit into the 18th century genre of what's called the loco-descriptive poem. In other words, poems that describe picturesque locations. So Wordsworth, in the title then, Wordsworth's detailed explanation of the time and place the poem was written signals to his 18th century readers that it's going to be that kind of highly descriptive poem. But it clearly also breaks from its 18th century roots in its intensely personal subject matter. It clearly aims to do much more than just describe the landscape. It wants to describe the subject of feeling inspired by the landscape. And it throws in a meditation on time, memory, and the nature of the human heart while it's at it. I mentioned last week that the critic M.H. Abrams made up the category of greater romantic lyric, and he created it very much for poems like Tintern Abbey. It's not really an ode, but it has that kind of extended reflection on a theme leading to some deeper insight, which is characteristic of many of the longer romantic poems. The poem begins with an act of memory. Wordsworth compares the scene of his memory to the one that's actually in front of him. Recalling Charlotte Smith's Beachy Head, which is very much modeled on Wordsworth's poem. In a similar way, she begins with a natural scene and uses it as a platform for an act of imagination that takes her beyond the limitations of the particular time and place that the speaker happens to be. So in both poems, we have the speakers comparing the scene in front of them to their past memories of it. In Tintern Abbey, this comparison is emphasized through the use of repetition in the poem, particularly at the beginning. Notice the extent of the repetition just in the first two lines. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And it goes on. I've color coded the repetitions in these first few lines. 3 uses of the word 5, length and long, again, secluded to seclusion. So all of these uses of repetition signal the inescapable memory of the past being revived in the present, being repeated in the present. The repetition also allies itself with a feeling of the overwhelming power of the speaker's reflections. It's almost as if he simply can't control his own responses to nature, and the eloquence that one might expect from a poet turns into this kind of effusive praise that tends toward repetition and even almost a kind of stylistic awkwardness. And notice also that repetition in the poem is often allied with a deliberate abstraction. The words that are repeated in the poem are very often ones that lack a concrete image. Again, thought, things are words that continually recur in this poem. And some of the most famous lines of this poem are also the most vague. The speaker says, "We see into the life of things." What exactly does that mean? He refers to a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things and objects of all objects of all thought and rolls through all things. Again, describing a very vague and abstract principle. Or earlier when he says, "For nature then to me was all in all." Again, a vague formulation. So the poem seems to convey Wordsworth's sense of the impossibility of pinning down this spirit in language. And following Burke, this is what he calls this a sense sublime. But the significant shift here is that what was sublime for Burke were external objects, but Wordsworth is using the word to apply to an internal subjective feeling. He compares his glad animal movements of 5 years ago to his current state of mind. He's lost this unreflective immersion in nature, but he says, "Not for this faint eye, nor mourn nor murmur. Other gifts have followed. For such loss I would believe abundant recompense." But what is this recompense? "For I have learned to look on nature not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity." So how is this recompense? What is the upside of the still sad music of humanity? And again, we might see the echoes of other lyrical ballads we've read here, that in both Simon Lee and Lines Written in Early Spring, Wordsworth describes happy scenes which make him reflect upon sadness, the still sad music of humanity. Elsewhere in the poem, he suggests that this recompense is having thoughts to sustain him, as he says, "mid the din of towns and cities." Just as the daffodils can make him happy when he can't see them, so too does this scene bring him joy when he isn't there. But again, going back to that phrase, the still sad music of humanity, we might think how the other lyrical ballads we've read might color this phrase as well. That it's not just a meaningless generalization, it's filled with particular cases, such as that of Simon Lee, for example. The rustics and outcasts that populate the other lyrical ballads demonstrate this more vague and general principle. Which leads us to another question. Is Wordsworth alone in this landscape? What traces are there of these rustic characters that in the other lyrical ballads are all over the place? At the beginning of the poem, Wordsworth, the speaker, acknowledges vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods and the wreaths of smoke that they send up. But these other figures kind of disappear after line 22, and it becomes much more explicitly and exclusively about Wordsworth himself. So what's going on here is this Wordsworth's way of effacing the world around him, saying, enough with all these rustic characters, let's talk about me now. Or are those rustic characters in some way necessary to enable the kind of reflection that we see in this poem? Also, at the end of this poem, we see the speaker turning to his sister. In empirical terms, William Wordsworth acknowledging Dorothy. But we might ask, why does it take 100 lines before we actually notice that she's there? And we might also think about what exactly is Wordsworth's tone towards her. He seems to be trying to teach her a lesson. There's a didacticism to the poem. Do we take this tone as somewhat condescending? That he seems to adopt a position of knowing better what is good for her. And we've seen in some of the other lyrical ballads that there are dialogues, some of which are productive, some of which are not. Is it significant here that Dorothy doesn't even get to reply? Does she become, in a way, another version of Matthew, only there for Wordsworth to imprint his own beliefs upon? And the end of the poem has a number of echoes of the beginning, the lofty thoughts that we get in line 128 echo the lofty cliffs that he beholds in line 5, establishing the way that the landscape has been internalized and it has expanded his mind. We then return again to those lofty cliffs in line 157 and to a green pastoral landscape in 158, which echoes the pastoral farms green to the very door from lines 17 to 18. The poem then ends with the speaker's hope that the scenes being described are also sustaining for his sister, and that they are dear to her because he loved them, both for themselves and for thy sake. There's a kind of mutually reinforcing love of nature, that he wants her to love him for loving nature, which he loves partly for her. Which is kind of circular, but we might ask to conclude here, does this poem end on a positive note? Is this a happy ending, could we say, or are we left with a sense of loss, of something that cannot be recaptured in this poem?